welcome back to the Arise News.
Welcome
to the
back
morning
to the morning show.
The Arise News. You distracted me, Dr. Ampati. One of the fundamental expectations of the developing world media is always to report news with development in mind. But looking back now, the question of whether or not this has worked in the overall interest of developing world countries continues to assume more frequency and importance. What has gone wrong with this approach? Here in Nigeria, have the media overplayed their hands by getting too close to the establishment? And how well has the Buhari administration performed in its three key areas of focus, including the economy, war against insurgency, and anti-corruption? For a wider conversation on all these and more, we're now being joined by Eluem Emeka Izeze, a former managing director and editor-in-chief of the Guardian Newspapers Limited. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good morning. Good to see you. I'm good, yes. Well, I mean, this is a familiar territory for you. Developmental journalism, development communication. Yeah. I mean, for many years, you presided over, for about 2 decades, you provided over a media operation. But what I see here is that there's always some conflict between people on the government side and people in the media houses. The people on the government side, they say, journalists should defend national interests. And the journalist says, well, I have a job to do. I'm also committed to national interest, but, we have to be critical about it. So where exactly should we draw the line in terms of using communication for development and at the same time telling the truth as it is in an accurate manner?
If the job is done well, there shouldn't be any sort of controversy. That when you're doing the right thing, you're also helping the country. What has happened is that when they throw up this tag, development journalism, they're not looking for proper journalism to be done. They're looking for some sort of patronizing coverage of events, and they tend to invoke patriotism, and they tell you that what matters to us is not these things, highfalutin ideals, democracy, freedom, and things like that. I would rather concentrate on dealing with developments. We cannot get development without doing our jobs as professionals, whether as journalists or people in other spheres of life. Professionalism is what brings development, and we ought to understand that. That's why development journalism has not worked. It hasn't quite worked anywhere as they expect it to. Instead, it has tended to erode the credibility of the press, because it then draws the press away from its original vision, original assignment of really chronicling events and leading the way, and it tends to make the press part of the establishment, part of the government, and that's the wrong thing to do.
So I now recall Joseph Pulitzer's quote about the Republic and the press rise and fall together. So he referred to able, disinterested, public-spirited journalists. Yeah. What do we do to get back on course?
We have to get journalism to begin to face what journalism ought to face, which is serving. Journalism has too many roles. It's a representative of the public. We ought to see ourselves as representatives of the public, not elected by anybody, but that's the role that the way the world runs, the way the world is set up, that's the role it has conferred on journalism, that we are representatives of governments, of the people, that people will never get to ask questions of their leaders and rulers, but we have the opportunity to do those. We are also purveyors of ideas. We set agenda. That's sort of trite these days. We throw up ideas on how things ought to be done well and done better. And we should hold the authority to account for their actions. If you don't do any of this, and all we do is simply reporting stories that will be favorable to the state, and we're very patriotic journalists. And by the way, you can be patriotic without necessarily being subservient. And we ought to draw a line between both. What people in government tend to ask for is for you to become subservient to the state. But as I said, you are a representative of the public, and you have a role to play. You watch over what happens, and you raise questions that the people can't ask. You get answers to the people, and you get their own feedback to the same people governing them. That's why journalism that thrives, that succeeds, tends to be, even in a subtle manner, tend to be more adversarial.
Well, one concern in Nigeria is that at some point, we suddenly discovered that many of the newspapers were now being owned by people with partisan political interests. And the ones that are not owned by partisan political interests also have some other interests with the establishment, either commercial or religious or whatever. And despite this, there is a lot of complaint that, look, can we trust the media in Nigeria? Can we trust the social media, the print media, the broadcast media in Nigeria if everybody is now shooting an angle, as different from what we had maybe in the 70s and 60s?
There will always be interest in the ownership of the media. The owners are not going to come from the moon, they're going to come from the earth. And because they're coming from this earth, they're going to have interests of their own to tend to protect and project. The difference between successful newspapers and unsuccessful ones is that the successful ones have owners that know that if this is going to work, I have to step back. I have my interest, but my interest must not be cloud what they do here. I think that we ought to also begin to question the practices of the journalists. It's very easy, in my view, to blame the owners and to say that the owners are the ones who are ensuring that journalists are not practicing their profession the way they ought to. But I think that professionals, coming back to that again, professionals ought to operate as professionals. You can do that even while defending the interest of the owner. And you do your job, journalism is well done, the owner's interest is protected, and the society is better for it. We can't afford to have, it's not a matter of having one or the other. Either protect the interests of the owners or the politicians, or I protect the interests of the public. You can do your job very well. I think that the problem we have now has a little bit to do with ownership pattern, but it has more to do with the practitioners themselves. And I'm sorry if I'm being too critical, because, I mean, this is where one has spent all his life, and looking back now, some of the questions I get to be asked these days, I discover that sometimes I don't have answers for them. You see, you're seeing things now that you were not seeing before, which is true. I can see things now because I'm now standing on the corridor. I'm removed from the action, and I'm reading newspapers every day. I'm looking at the editorials, and I'm asking myself, what kind of thing is this?
I hope you don't get tempted to pick your red pen and start editing.
Sometimes I will have to actually...
I have to stop doing that at the point.
Really?
Because so you're asking yourself, has it always been this bad, or is it because you are no longer there that you can... or that there is something that has happened? I think that in recent times in particular, journalists have gotten too close to politicians, to politics, to government.
I hope you are not looking in my direction.
No, Ruben. You went in, when you went into government, you left journalism. So we didn't expect you to be an ambassador in government. That's not what they do. You were taking a basket of expertise, and most of which you got from journalism, you take into that place, and it worked. But when you are practicing journalism, you ought to be a journalist. If you are not, then you're really not serving the society, you're not serving the public, and you're doing yourself a great deal of discredit. I think that most of our journalists don't seem to get this. You write your testimonial on a daily basis. You write your testimonial daily, and those testimonials tend to hold over time. You think that people forget. People don't forget. People tend to remember how you operate. operated while you were active, and they will impose a value judgment on you. Those value judgments tend to stick with you, some of them all through one's lifetime.
That's an ominous warning there, sir. But you've established the fact that certain interests are not mutually exclusive.
Sure.
But I want to follow on from Dr. Abati's question. Yeah. Media organizations, like any organization, exist to generate an income, a profit, as do the media practitioners as individuals. Yeah. So how do people balance that with the public interest?
Very easy. Very, very easy. Look, good journalism sells. Bad journalism doesn't sell. If you do good journalism, you are going to make more money than those doing bad journalism. We practice that, and Dr. Abati can tell you that it worked where he worked before. And I think where he's still working now. Good journalism attracts good business. Nobody wants to put his money in a paper that nobody is reading. Nobody wants to put his advertising because it's doing you a favor. They don't do you a favor by putting advertising in the paper. They're putting advertising in the paper because they know that the people they want to see the advertising are the people reading the newspaper. And I think that it's one of the reasons why we have to be more professional. When you become more professional, you make more money for your employer. They become happier. Employers, few of them will probably set up newspaper and want to use it for their own political end, but most of them will want to also make money, get back the amount of money they invested in the business. Journalists can help, number one, by elevating the tone of discussion and being slightly more professional than we have been, seeing yourself with more respect, treating yourself as such with a lot more respect, and doing things that will make others take a second look at you, not usually dismissing you as one of those journalists. Because really, I mean, now we see journalists who have become governors, and they have come out. And we have even seen some who have tried to be presidents, and we have seen journalists who are senators. We have seen journalists who left journalism and went to other areas of spheres of human endeavor, and they have succeeded. So we really ought to see this as one of the most sacred assignments you do. It doesn't pay you too well as an individual, but it pays a whole lot of dividend to the society.
Well, MD, I recall that once upon a time in this country when some people were saying that if you computerize operations in the newsroom, that you will turn reporters into criminals because they will be using computers, to do some other things. But you were, one of those people who championed the idea of the digitalization of the newsroom, the use of advanced technology to process news. And you also, were very enthusiastic about the social media. But when you look back now, are you still, enthusiastic about social media, about the cyberspace as a positive force for professional developments in journalism?
Oh yeah, because the future really is digital, and the future is not going to be as we do it now all the time. The printed paper will always exist, but look, in this time and age, we have never had as much news as we are having now. In this time and age, we have never had as many people reading and listening to news and discussing news from the time records began to be kept as we have now.
Well, we'll just take a short break, and then when we come back, you'll continue with that development in the news cycle. We'll take a short commercial break, and we'll return. Stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us in the studio is Eluem Emeka Izeze, former managing director and editor-in-chief of the Guardian newspapers Nigeria, and a veteran journalist. Now, Mr. Izeze, before we went on break, you were talking about this new age of news, the age of information, and changes in the newsroom and how that affects how journalism is practiced.
I was saying that we have more people now reading news than at any other time in history. We have more people producing news, generating news than at any other time in history. And it can only be a positive development, which is why good journalism will always make money. Because if there is anything that social media has done for the world, is that social media has brought the news business to everyone. And people are more interested now in news. Oh, obviously, there are some undesirable news items that can be circulating all over, but the better ones are more in number. And if you know what you're looking for, you will always get what is right for you. I think that the social media can become a force for good, even for mainstream journalism. You cannot begin to remove the social media from the mainstream journalism and as if they are different, because they are not. You might well end up eroding again the credibility of one in preference for the other. It shouldn't be. I think that the established media houses must see the social media for what it is. Nobody breaks news in the newspaper anymore. Even television is beginning to struggle with social media to break news. Because before you have time to put it out on air, not to talk of print, it's already out in the World Wide Web. Somebody had already flashed it, and you can't imagine how many millions are already picking it up. So you don't break news, but you give a better understanding of the news that just occurred a minute ago, an hour ago, a day ago, or a week ago. You give a basis for it. You help people to live with the kind of information that will enable them to survive on Earth because of that news that you're spreading. And the social media, therefore, has become more complementary to the established media and should be seen as such. If we begin to treat the social media as such, we're going to find that the business of news, journalism, is stronger today than at any other time. And I was watching an old video played in programs elsewhere, and it was showing how many people were in journalism at a specific time, how many newspapers were they publishing. But this is Lagos today. You have so many newspapers, you have so many radio stations, you have so many television stations, you have so many social media publications, all in one city. And we all have a niche that we all carved out for ourselves, and we seem to be surviving in each of our niches. So I think that the social media should be encouraged to play the role of a force for good, both for the society and for journalism. And we shouldn't go looking to de-emphasize the social media or stigmatize or demonize the social media. Neither should we also attempt to turn the established press to the fast food sort of news that social media produces. We shouldn't even go into those, otherwise you miss it.
So while we're on social media, sir, are you one of those who bristles at the term citizen journalist, as some do, understandably?
Yeah. No, I don't bristle at it. Maybe I look at it all positively, because citizen journalism, Juno, it's been terms that they have been conversing for a very long time. I remember that years back, the American Society of Newspaper Editors has a journal that they do, and then I did an article there because then everybody was complaining that this social media is going to destroy journalism, and I said I don't see it as such. And I'm glad to say that, just as I was saying in that article, that there will be established press, but the social media is the future, because we're growing up and we're growing a population that lives on technology that didn't exist when we were ourselves, even as young as some of us are when we were growing up. I mean, this thing, to think that this is just 20 years in Nigeria today, you ask yourself, how did we manage to survive without the mobile phone when we were surviving?
Let's talk about the media in Nigeria and the Buhari administration. I mean, the media in Nigeria has a tradition, as you know, of courageous intervention, of robustness, of fearlessness. But some persons who operate on social media, they now claim that you'll find more courage, more, criticism on social media than in the mainstream media. Yeah. And that the mainstream media seems to have sold out, either out of fear or out of cautiousness, and that, the media is not doing enough assessment of the Buhari administration in particular. Do you share that view?
Yes and no. See, the social media gives you a certain basis for anonymity, and people can do anything if they're not going to be seen easily. That anonymity is what makes people tend to do some of the things they do in the social media, many of which are really not true journalism. And because there are good journalists and journalism institutions already operating in the social media space, and they're there. But there are those who think that if you are going to show courage, then just go to the social media and start saying whatever you want to say, or manufacture stories. Those things. So the social media, in my view, should treat itself as seriously as a established media. We call it formal media. I don't think anybody had found the right term for it yet. Formal, established, whatever.
Mainstream.
But mainstream, I don't know which is not mainstream. many young people reading news today who never read news before, they read it all because the social media is there churning news out around the clock, 24 hours, and 7 days a week, 365 days in a year. And there's no Sunday, there's no Saturday. Wherever they are, whenever news breaks, you get it somewhere from someone on something, some sort of platform. And you're consuming the news yourself, and you're giving instant feedback also, because then you begin to make some comments, or you begin to forward it to people. You also become a distributor. I think that the social media should take itself more seriously, but not by assuming that you can go there and say things that are not, things that you can't substantiate and claim to be showing courage. No, it's not courage. Journalism is journalism. You cannot have news that is not well covered, that is not well written, that does not tell the truth. If it's on the social media and you call that courage, that's not journalism. It may be something else. But if you're dealing with news on social media or mainstream or established media, the same standards apply. The standards of accuracy, of fairness, of objectivity, of truth-telling. The same, you must cover both sides. The same standards ought to apply. And we must insist that it should, because it's already happening elsewhere. Ours shouldn't be different. I understand that Nigerian media thrives mostly when it's adversarial to government. So when people look at how the media is operating today, and I do have my complaints also, I think it's mostly born out of timidity. And sometimes there's too much respect. Let's not rock the boat. Sometimes you have to rock the boat for things to get moving.
Well, will you prefer to use the word fear?
Yes.
Of reprisals or sanctions?
I'm not even sure there is so more that people should be afraid today. Look, we operated in this place when the fear wasn't about being thrown into jail. It's about being killed. Yeah. And that didn't stop journalists from operating. So why should people be afraid? I think, to tell you the truth, I think many of our practitioners simply got too ensconced in partisan interests. And people who started taking sides and they started coloring the way we report news. You can have your political views without necessarily it affecting the way you report news. Every human being has a political view. Every human being ought to have a political view. But we are still journalists, and news is news in spite of our political views. We are not different from the rest of human community. The same human beings in Nigeria are human beings in Europe and North America and elsewhere. They are practicing as journalists. They have their own views. So hold your political views without allowing it to color what you do. Sometimes you don't cover events because you think if I do it, I will not be holding true to my views that I support this. You don't have to support anybody to the point of not being able to do your job as a journalist. When we start doing that, as some, I suspect some are doing now, it will affect everybody, not only those doing it, because then people will be giving a sweeping judgment on all of us.
Absolutely. That's standard again, able, disinterested, and public-spirited.
That's standard again.
Yes, but I want to know your political views, sir. What are your thoughts on the Buhari administration so far in the areas of security, anti-corruption, and economic growth? Very briefly, sir.
I think that they haven't done too well on the economy. I think the anti-corruption effort, there's so much motion and I don't see too much movement, if you ask me. It's the same noises that we hear, that you see hearing. I haven't seen real serious fight against corruption. By the way, real serious fight against corruption will begin with putting in place structures that will deliver good governance. You can lock up all the thieves in this country. It's not going to do a dent to the corruption if the system that breeds it are still standing. And as for security, they have made some very honest efforts. But they came with the view that it was very easy to deal with, and they have just discovered that when you are in the opposition, things seem to be easier for you until you get into government. Boko Haram is still there. Since Boko Haram will now have ISWAP, and I don't want to go into that because that's a different area. How many are operating around here? How many are operating under Boko Haram? How many are operating under ISWAP? How many are operating under all kinds of groups? I don't want that. So, but they made some efforts. I think if I were advising government, I would say pay attention to security. That's your area of comparative advantage over everyone else.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emeka Izeze.
Thank you, sir.
We've enjoyed this conversation with you very much.
Thank you.
We hope we could continue, but time is not on our side. Thank you very much indeed.
It's time now for a short break on the morning show.